Greetings, fellow moviegoers, and welcome to Movie Central, the place to talk about movies, TV shows based on movies, toys based on movies, games based on movies, and rides based on movies. I'm your host, Mr. CCS, and this is my pet gorilla, George. Well, seeing as how I finished the DC Animated Universe reviews, what other animated show could I recover from DC before I get back to the live-action properties? Well, I could talk about Teen Titans, but unfortunately I haven't seen it yet, all of it. So you may think I'm stumped. But there is one more show that I could talk about, and it just so happens to be a very underrated show, in my mind. With that said, let's get into a bit of history before I talk about this show. After Batman the Animated Series, there wasn't anything great Batman related for a long time. I mean, think about it, the movies at the time were painful to sit through, mainly because of Batman and Robin. But by the 2000s, when Justice League was on air, there was, of course, Teen Titans, which revitalized Western animation as we know it, giving us more of an anime-inspired art style and a lighter tone, but still retaining some dark elements. So Batman is a success, Teen Titans is a success. Why not combine the two and make an anime-inspired show similar to Teen Titans, and even subtly connect the two at some point? Well, that's exactly what they did, because Jeff Matsuda, comic book artist and animator, gave us this show that did just that, combining the dark elements of The Dark Knight and combining it with Teen Titans to make, in my eyes, a highly underrated show. How underrated, you may ask? Well, we're going to find out. This is The Batman. Gotham City, the most crime-ridden city in the world, filled to the brim with gangsters, supervillains, and corrupt officials. Only one can bring it all to justice. Only one can claim the night as his own. One will purge Gotham's mess. Bruce Wayne, billionaire by day, vigilante by night. The Batman. So I'm not going to be a person who claims that this show is as deep and as complex as BTAS, because it isn't. It doesn't take more risks, it doesn't have stronger writing and animation, nor does it have better episodes, but it is still very fun and energetic. As I said before, it takes BTAS and mixes it with Titans, and it is a very good mix of the styles. You would think it wouldn't really work, but this show does have its darker moments. You would be surprised. It has lighter moments too, but more towards the end, and they aren't super on the nose. But enough rambling, let's talk about the characters. So this show has a pretty big cast of characters, with probably the largest amount of characters in the Rogues Gallery in any Batman show. Now they aren't all here. Fans will notice the absence of Scarecrow, Two-Face, and Ra's al Ghul. That's because Batman Begins was coming out at the time, and two of those villains were going to be used in that movie, and the other in the sequel. The Joker was the exception, of course, to this role because of how big of a villain he is. Scarecrow is the closest of these three to be in the show, and he had a pretty decent character design, but he never made it in. I would be upset, but the big cast of villains do make up for it. We have some lesser-known threats Batman takes on here, such as the Clue Master, Spellbinder, Maxie Zeus, and Ragdoll. The show, also like BTAS, does introduce some new original villains like the Toymaker, the Everywhere Man, and Rumor. There are just so many characters in this show, but I'll be focusing on some of the bigger characters that were in the show for impressionable amounts of time, starting with the villains. Black Mask, voiced by James Remar. This is the first time Black Mask has made an appearance in animation. I think the reason they held him off for so long is how violent of a character he really was, but his appearance here is noteworthy. In the comics, Roman Sionis is a very ruthless member of the mob who wears a skull mask and tortures and murders. Here, Sionis was toned down, but still maintains his personality of being a frightening individual who runs crime in Gotham. He was on the show towards the end and became one of my favorite Batman villains ever because of this show. As a matter of fact, I would love to see him in live action soon. I am aware he was in the Birds of Prey movie, but we don't talk about that version. Moving on. Killer Croc, voiced by Ron Perlman. It's weird how I prefer this version of Croc compared to the BTAS Croc, but that's mainly because of how interesting this one is. I love the design as he resembles an actual crocodile man. The vest also adds to him being a water dweller who is frightening, and the fact that he had an accent representing the fact that he's from the south adds to how great this version of Croc is. Not my favorite whatsoever, but definitely one that is noteworthy. Sorry, BTAS Croc, you just couldn't crack my favorites. This version of Croc takes that spot. Bane, voiced by Joaquim de Almeida, Ron Perlman, and Clancy Brown. Yeah, Bane's voiced by 3 voice actors in this show. Get over it. Bane's is certainly a weird character in this show, mainly because of the design. For some reason, when he's on the Venom, he resembles Forearms from Ben 10. It's not a complaint, but it's just a very interesting thing to mention. Bane only had 4 appearances on the show, but I like the character too much to not mention him here. They did the Nightfall storyline early on in the first season, which rubs a few the wrong way, but I find it to be a great way to build Batman's character, and how he has to grow and gain his status of fear. Bane didn't have too much to do in this show, but I'm okay with it, because he's still a fun enough character to watch. Firefly, voiced by Jason Marsden. It's weird that this version of Firefly is also better than the BTAS version. I mean, look at this design. The black and yellow color scheme is perfect, and I wouldn't change anything about it. Surprisingly enough, though, Linz was a character that was with the show since the beginning, making him a staple in Batman's Rogues Gallery from then on, even teaming up with Mr. Freeze at one point in the show. In the 5th season, they do something that I wouldn't personally do, though. They turned him into a character called Phosphorus because he's exposed to such high levels of heat. But I personally prefer it when he's just stayed as himself because he's more recognizable that way. But other than that, Firefly is a worthy character to this show, hands down. Poison Ivy and Harley Quinn, voiced by Piera Coppola and Hinton Walsh. I grouped these 2 together because they are both very different from their original counterparts. Ivy was actually de-aged to a teenager in this show for some reason, which doesn't make all that sense to me because she was always closer in age to Batman, but here they make her Batgirl's age. It also doesn't help that she doesn't do much in her time on the show. She has 1 real appearance, and then she's reduced to a side villain for the rest of the series. Why such a mishandling? Whatever, it doesn't bother me too much. As for Harley, instead of being a psychiatrist, she's a reality show host that gets manipulated by the Joker to do his bidding. Now, I would be upset at the lack of comic book accuracy, but I'm not a big Harley Quinn fan, so I'm not really going to say anything. Hearing Hinton Walsh, someone who made the character of Starfire her own, voice Harley was very fun. And she has done it a few more times since then in Assault on Arkham, Hush, and Apocalypse War. But we'll get to those down the line. I like Harley in this show, but not as much as BTAS or as much as in the Arkham games. Hugo Strange, voiced by Frank Gorshin and Richard Green. Yes, the original TV Riddler voices Hugo Strange in this show, which is definitely a choice. While Hugo's time to shine wouldn't be until Arkham City, his inclusion here was pretty fun, as it does show that supercriminals aren't Batman's only opponents. There will be other roadblocks along the way. Gorshin did pass away in 2005, so the rest of the time, Strange is voiced by Richard Green. And the voice is very similar upon reflection, but Gorshin was my personal favorite of the 2, mainly because he proved he can play a serious villain after making a fool of himself on the 1966 show as Riddler. Mr. Freeze, voiced by Clancy Brown. You may be wondering what my thoughts on this version of Freeze are, mainly because this show completely dropped the backstory with Nora, which is the definitive story for the character. I was originally upset, but then I realized this show wouldn't have worked with that backstory too much. But then I reflected again, and realized that this show wrote some emotional backstory for some other characters, so why not Freeze? I feel like it's because they wanted to stand out from BTAS, but everybody uses the origin story from Heart of Ice now, so why does it matter? My little rants aside though, Mr. Freeze being a little more fantastical here is pretty cool. Him essentially bending ice is pretty fun to watch. And to see him be Batman's final and longest lasting villain is also really interesting to see, and something that could be explored more. Mr. Freeze is a good villain on the show, just not as good as the other versions. The Riddler, voiced by Robert Englund. You guys know that the Riddler is my all-time favorite Batman villain, and this version of him is one of my absolute favorites. The gothic design he takes on with the long hair and black makeup are really cool additions to Riddler's character. It makes him look truly broken and insane, yet he still has an intelligence. The backstory they added for him is very sympathetic, and I definitely felt for him, even though he was an absolute monster. The version of the Riddler in this show is one of the best villains on this show, and one of the best adaptations of the character, only beaten out by BTAS, the Matt Reeves film, and the Arkham games. The Penguin, voiced by Tom Kenny. Yes, Freaking SpongeBob SquarePants voices the penguin in this show. Surprisingly, the yellow sponge who lives in a pineapple under the sea is not the only role that Tom Kenny can do. As the penguin, he takes the stupid, over-the-top, gravelly voice Burgess Meredith did in the 1960s and somehow made it work. The penguin in this show is a gross rich man obsessed with birds that has henchwomen in the form of kabuki twins. They are skilled and deadly as they are fun to watch. And they add how much of a rich jerk the penguin really is. While not my favorite version of the ruffled bird, he's definitely one that is noteworthy. The Joker, voiced by Kevin Michael Richardson. You can't have a Batman property without the Clown Prince of Crime, and this version of the Clown is somewhat unique and calls for a different kind of introduction. I mean, just look at his design, the dreadlocks, the red eyes, the acrobatic fight style, all of it. They turn Joker into a very unique character, and a version that I'm okay with seeing more adopted, because I kind of like Joker being characterized like this. Yes, he's in a lot of this show, but I think he's necessary for the show because the Joker is a staple of Batman, which is why I think he isn't overused in properties, which may be a controversial thing to say, by the way. Alright, those are some of them villains. Let's talk about the main characters that this show follows that are heroes or good. Jim Gordon, voiced by Mitch Pileggi. Surprisingly, Jim didn't appear on the show until the end of season 2, which is kind of odd, but the reason why is kind of understandable. In the first 2 seasons, the leader of the GCPD was Chief Angel Rojas, a more corrupt and stern individual who sent 2 detectives after Batman. But by the 3rd season, the show took more of a comic book based feel rather than the detective story. Jim's inclusion in the show was the right move because he is a staple to Batman and one that cannot be left out in any way. He doesn't do much, but he does leave an impression, which is always important to note because he's a staple to Batman's lore and they did a good job with his character. Ethan Bennett and Ellen Yin, voiced by Steve Harris and Ming-Na Wen. As I had mentioned before, the show took more of a grounded, competing detective route before embracing the comic book side. Bennett and Yin were 2 detectives that worked for the GCPD and were initially rivals of Batman until towards the end of the first season where they started working together. Unfortunately, at the end of the first season also, Bennett was mutated into this show's Clayface, which revoked his status with the GCPD and his friendship with Bruce Wayne, established early on. Yin stayed as a detective until the end of season 2, where she was revoked of her position when Rojas found out she had worked with Batman. Bennett had closure to his character later on, where Basil Karlo, the Clayface from the comics, mutates into the monster and the 2 battle it out, with Karlo remaining as the show's Clayface until the show ended. I would have liked to see more of Yin, personally, but Bennett's arc was cool, and admittedly one of the better parts of the newer characters invented for the show, so there you go. Robin and Batgirl, voiced by Evan Sabara and Danielle Judovitz. These 2 are staples of Batman's lore, so of course they were implemented here. Batgirl was introduced first because Robin couldn't be used based on his presence in Teen Titans, but by the beginning of the 4th season, Dick Grayson was written into the show and was Batman's more primary sidekick. Both of these adaptations are great, especially because it's confirmed that Dick went on to become Nightwing and Barbara became Batgirl. Oracle. Sorry. It's also really fun to see these 2's dynamics play off of each other. Alfred, voiced by Alistair Duncan. Alfred is one of those characters that appeared in every single episode of the show, and of course the faithful butler did not disappoint whatsoever. Not only is this one of my favorite versions of Alfred, but also one who is consistently good throughout the series. His chemistry with Bruce comes off once again like a father and son relationship, which is something I come to expect these days. Batman, voiced by Rino Romano. As the lead character of this show, the Dark Knight himself is a very well done character. He's younger, less experienced vigilante, one that does know how to hold his own in a fight. He's not too different from DCAU Batman in terms of characteristics, but he is different in age and experience. This Batman also got to fight Dracula too, but more on that later, because that is quite a feat. So Batman is very good in this show and is brilliantly voiced by Rino Romano, someone who I'd like to hear more of as Batman. So that's about it for the characters that I want to talk about. So let's talk about the animation style that the show adopts. Much like Teen Titans, we have a very unique animated style that is more anime based. It allows for a lot more dynamic movement and unique designs. The Batmobile in particular looks a lot like a sports car in this series, which is definitely a choice, and one that was done really well. As far as the music goes, the style for the music changed 40% through the series. Originally, it was a cool, calm, and eerie sort of rock style before the tone of the show changed and took on a more comic book style, so that it embraced a louder, bigger comic book based idea. The styles are both great, but for Batman, I much prefer the softer music. As far as individual episodes go, I don't want to drone on for too long because I'd be here all day. But I'd recommend every episode of the first and second seasons. Specifically, the season 1 finale, the rubber face of comedy slash clay face of tragedy, Riddled, Night in City, Grundy's Night, Traction, The Bat and the Cat and the Bats, The Big Chill, and The Bat and the Belfry, and The Call of the Cobblepot. The later seasons had more expendable episodes, season 3 being my least favorite. I can recommend mainly the premiere episode of season 3 and Brawn, but that's about it. Season 4 was a lot better though, and I can recommend the episodes of Matter of Family, Team Penguin, Clay Faces, Artifacts, Riddler's Revenge, Two of a Kind, Rumors, and the finale, The Joining. As for the 5th season, watch the Batman slash Superman story, Vertigo, A Mirror Darkly, Ring Toss, What Goes Up, and finally, Lost Heroes. And I can also recommend the movie The Batman vs. Dracula, which I'll expand upon more in a later video. Hashtag shameless plug. I mean, that's where the Dark Knight battles the Prince of Darkness in a pretty ballsy and risky movie that I would say is highly underrated based on DC animated films. But stay tuned to find out what my actual thoughts on it are. So that's all I have to say about The Batman. Is it the greatest animated Batman show? No. It sort of lost me in the 3rd season, picked up in the 4th season, but sort of lost me again in the 5th. But I do recommend it to mainly hardcore DC fans and Bat fans alike. The show as a whole, from me, gets a 9 out of 10. Not the best, but definitely pretty damn good. Well, that's it for this review. Feel free to leave your thoughts on this show in the comment section below, and tune in next week when we get back to live action films when I take a look at Batman Begins. With that said, my name is Mr. CCS, this is Movie Central, and that, my friends, is a wrap. See you next week.